Okay. Thank you, Crimson. Actually, fire was one of those revelations for me when I went to Burning Man, because so many years I had been looking at all of these things in kind of a more academic context, and the ephemerality you get and all of those things, but then when you are there, confronted by that heat and that pop, it's incredible. And yeah, I was standing there talking to Dwayne Flatmo this last year in rapid transit, and my eyebrows are singeing off, and it gives you a whole different impression of the art, which I loved. But in any event, so next up, I'm excited to welcome Burning Man founder Mikel, aka Danger Ranger, who participated in Burning Man for the first time in 1988. And he's a founding member also of the San Francisco Cacophony Society. And I have to admit that this is one of the presentations that I have been really looking forward to, because during my own research on this, it was the antics of the Cacophony Society that most had me wrapped. It was my perfect bedtime story every night. So I can't wait to hear more about those early years of Burning Man. In 1991, Mikel brought the first art card to Burning Man. A year later, Mikel edited the first Black Rock City newspaper and founded Black Rock City's force of non-confrontational community mediators and facilitators for public safety, the Black Rock Rangers. So he'll tell us more about those years. Welcome, Mikel.
Thank you. High mischief to high tech. I'd like to thank the Renwick for asking me here to speak. Some of you may be wondering who I am and why I'm telling this story. Burning Man and I have evolved along the same path and have been guided by the same influences. In the 1960s, the Navy sent me from Texas to the San Francisco Bay Area. I'd always liked things that were weird and unusual, and when I arrived in San Francisco, I saw evidence everywhere of other people who loved the absurd and the playful. So after I got out of the service, I stayed in the Bay Area. I went to work in Silicon Valley as an engineer during the early days of the personal computer. I worked for Fairchild Semiconductor during the 1970s. I once passed up an offer to join a new startup called Intel. I never regretted that decision. In the early 1980s, I managed the installation of Apple Computer's first robotic assembly line. After that, I helped start one of the first technology companies to be located in San Francisco, Jasmine Computer Systems. Now I'm a social engineer and historian, and I helped start Burning Man. I've attended 31 times, and I watched it evolve from the child of pranksters to the playground of rocket scientists. Burning Man began 33 years ago with about 10 people on a beach in San Francisco. Burning Man has since moved on, and yet it is still happening on a beach. But this beach is on the desert, 2 hours north of Reno, Nevada. Playa is a Spanish word for beach, but it is also a geological term that refers to a dry lake bed. Each summer, Burning Man takes place on the enormous dry lake bed of the Black Rock Desert. Here's what Burning Man looks like today. Malfunction. No advance. Now it's 75,000 participants. It's a lot more than Baker Beach could hold. So how did all this come about? Burning Man's roots lie in the post-war bohemian culture of San Francisco. Numerous underground social groups or subcultures were born there in the experimental decades after World War II. Some of them coexisted together, and some were replaced by their predecessors. But they all contributed to the rich stew of ideas that would eventually give rise to Burning Man. When I first arrived in San Francisco in 1962, courtesy of the US Navy, I went looking for the beat generation that I had heard so much about. The Beats were irreverent free thinkers that flatly rejected the aspirations of the post-war middle class. Symbolically, they had been beaten by a society that expected them to conform to a heterosexual marriage, 4 kids, and a station wagon. They chucked it all and hit the road. Along the way, they committed acts of radical prose and poetry to document their hobo journeys across America. A lot of them, Kerouac, Burroughs, Ginsberg, Cassidy, spent lots of time in San Francisco. They were way outside the culture that I grew up in. The San Francisco Renaissance was flourishing when I arrived. Soon I discovered the City Lights bookstore. Allen Ginsberg's landmark poem, Howl, had just been published 6 years before I arrived. It was so raw that he was put on trial for obscenity. Reading Howl had a big effect on me. It shook the very foundation of the worldview that I grew up with. I met Ginsberg briefly on the sidewalk near the City Lights bookstore, but he wasn't the only one I saw around town. This place was thick with characters. Like the Merry Pranksters, beat muse Neil Cassidy had fallen in with Ken Kesey and Tim Leary. They were doing acid tests and riding around in a bus called Further. And a group called the Diggers were doing guerrilla theater in the streets and blowing people's minds with free stores and free food. The actor Peter Coyote was one of the founders of the Diggers. The Diggers believed that Americans were afraid to act upon the freedom that our culture supposedly endorses. Their solution was to act viscerally and theatrically. Coyote thought if we create enough examples of free life by actually acting them out on the streets without the safety net of the stage, then people would have alternatives to society's skimpy menu of life choices. The Diggers were constantly out in the streets, staging provoking plays and tweaking people's reality. The Diggers were famous for their free stores, which is just what it sounds like. One day, Peter Coyote was manning the free store. A woman came in and was furtively shoplifting. Peter approached her and said, "You can't steal here because it's a free store. Read the sign. Everything is free. You can have the whole fucking store if you feel like it. You can take over and tell me to get lost." The Diggers wanted what Burning Man participants called bureaucracy, permission to act on your freedom and take charge. Permission was an incredibly important concept moving forward. This would influence the precursors of Burning Man. On top of that, the music scene was growing. The Charlatans, Janis Joplin, the Grateful Dead, Jefferson Airplane had established a distinctive San Francisco sound, and the streets were alive with costumed people. The thrift shops of the era were packed with vintage clothes and furniture from the Victorian era that could be had for pennies. Artists and musicians haunted the sidewalks in the flamboyant finery of a bygone age. These are the beginnings of participant-created content. Seeing all of this on the streets of San Francisco was my new normal, and I was studying everything with great interest. Finally, when I got out of the service, I stayed near the epicenter. During the 1970s, I'd heard about this group called the Suicide Club and the incredible stunts they were pulling. But I wasn't able to make contact with them. Taking their name and theme from a Robert Louis Stevenson story, the Suicide Club's purpose was to live life as though each day was their last. They played with heightened experience. For their first advertised event, you were advised to set your worldly affairs in order because you might not be coming back. To join the Suicide Club, you had to commit to experiencing things you had not experienced before. They climbed the Golden Gate Bridge at midnight. They played stalker games in abandoned buildings. They once rode the cable cars nude. For 5 years, the Suicide Club newsletter rolled out every month and listed many events from mile to wild. But they were very secretive and insular. They tended to avoid bringing in new members, and they ran out of steam by 1982 and disbanded. So I never did link up with them. But in 1988, I made contact with some of the survivors of the Suicide Club. They had recently begun a new, more open endeavor and called it the Cacophony Society. It was similar to the Suicide Club, but less secretive, and had more of a sense of humor. Each month, various members got together and did events which were odd, unusual, challenging, and usually pretty funny. I got heavily involved. The first time I organized an event, only 6 people showed up. But the next day, it was on the 5 o'clock news. I was hooked. It felt like we were the new mutants in society. To portray that idea, I created a 6-fingered hand that we used as a logo. Cacophony drew from all the eccentric San Francisco traditions that had preceded us: the Beats, the Merry Pranksters, the Diggers, and the Suicide Club. But unlike the Suicide Club, we made sure that we were not underground. Our motto was a randomly gathered network of free spirits united in pursuit of experiences beyond the pale of mainstream society. You may already be a member. We got just enough press to ensure a steady flow of new members and new ideas. We earned the label Pranksters. We loved eccentric people. From San Francisco history, we took our patron saint, Emperor Norton, a beloved homeless character from the 1890s. Another thing that Cacophony loved was Surrealism, and we shared that love with the Beats. The Beats had revered the Surrealist, who mixed dream with reality and tried to tap into the deep subconscious. The Surrealists thought games were very important to the creative process. They were okay with calling the whole thing a game. So Cacophony borrowed participatory games from the Surrealist, like the word game Exquisite Corpse. And we used odd and dreamlike juxtapositions of strange things. To that end, we organized tours of the underground sewer system in formal wear. And fancy dinners on the Golden Gate Bridge sidewalk. We also borrowed from the Dadaists their technique of collage. From the Diggers, we took guerrilla theater, the use of anonymity through fake names, the precursor of Playa names, and the idea that everything we did should be free. Also from the Diggers, we took permission to act on our freedom. We practiced sartorial freedom. We gave ourselves permission to do politically incorrect public theater, like Let Them Eat Cake, Wino Wine Tasting, and Bombs Not Food. And we gave ourselves permission to use forgotten locations, sneaking into abandoned buildings and underground tunnels. This music and dining experience was called the Atomic Cafe, which was held inside one of the old military batteries along the San Francisco coast. Cacophony was committed to responsible use of places. One of our rules was to clean up after ourselves. In fact, we often left a location cleaner than when we found it. Like the Suicide Club, we liked the idea of taking people outside their comfort zones, but in a way that was more conceptual and less boot camp dangerous. The city was our playground. There's one more important influence on Cacophony, the Situationist. They believed that the forces of modern life, capitalism, and the media in particular created spectacles that divorced people from direct experience. The Situationists delighted in turning the media's breathless creation of spectacle against itself. The Situationists were very political, so we took their methods but left out the politics. Our experience told us that politics divided people and threw up their defenses. We wanted to include everyone. We wanted everyone to think differently about reality for a few minutes and not get angry or defensive. The Fantasia protest was one of the Cacophony Society's finest situationist pranks. This was a time when every fringe group in the country was protesting something. We decided to protest the most innocent thing we could think of, a classic Disney cartoon. We organized a fake protest of the Disney movie Fantasia, bringing together a broad coalition of interests. We had much to be offended by. Dancing mushrooms were a reference to drugs. Hippopotamus ballerinas were offensive to fat activists. Color-coordinated heterosexual centaurs were offensive to gays and lesbians. And our environmentalists were especially upset about Mickey Mouse wasting water. And the springtime evolution sequence and nudity of animals was offensive to Christian fundamentalists. Yes, the truth is Donald Duck is not wearing pants. Somehow the absurdity of all this was overlooked, and every media outlet on the West Coast picked up the story. We even made Time magazine before the hoax was uncovered by the Washington Post. The Cacophony Society also produced pranks in printed form. We concocted subversions ranging from Leonard Stinch's babysitting service to psychic auto repair and several variations on lost pet. A 15-foot lost snake in Golden Gate Park was another that created a to-do when it made it into the local newspaper. I remember walking through Golden Gate Park a year later and overhearing a couple talking about the snake. In 1994, we hit on an idea that would become our special claim to infamy: pranking in conjunction with large holidays and other highly visible cultural events. For example, each year, thousands of people participate in the annual Beta Breakers foot race in San Francisco. It was like a river of costume humanity. So we ran it in the opposite direction, wearing salmon costumes. And when we reached the starting point, we spawned. I should probably apologize to the world for this one. In 1994, we wanted to take the central icon of Christmas consumerism and twist it around. So a couple dozen of us got these really cheap, cheesy Santa suits. Then we mobbed through downtown San Francisco, crashing society's parties, stumbling through department stores during the peak of the Christmas shopping season. This was not a bar crawl in the beginning. It was performance art. We repeated it a few more years, taking it to other cities, Los Angeles, Portland, Seattle, and New York. But after that, it took off with a mind of its own. Now it's really gotten out of hand. This is 5,000 Santas in New York City. These are some of the things that Cacophony was about to give to Burning Man. We had developed numerous traditions that made our events remarkable. Everyone was included. You had permission to be or try anything. Money was not involved. You took responsibility for your actions. If you used a public or abandoned space, you left it cleaner than when you found it. We were anonymous. We used fake names. Long before smartphones, the idea was to be here now. Duocracy. You have a great idea, you do it. Everyone was a participant, no spectators. And political and religious propaganda was unwelcome, which goes back to including everyone. So how does all this become Burning Man? We need to return to Baker Beach. In the 1970s and early 80s, an artist named Mary Grauberger used to hang around Baker Beach with a bunch of free spirits down at the naked end of the beach. She would spend the day building sculptures out of driftwood and burnt and washed up detritus. Then at nightfall, she and her friends would burn them. A guy named Larry Harvey was a friend of hers. He'd be there sometimes, especially on the summer solstice. By 1986, Mary had stopped doing her burning artworks on the beach. And on the summer solstice that year, Larry found himself missing it. So Larry decided to take up the torch, so to speak. He famously called his friend Jerry James and said, "Hey, let's build a man and burn him on the beach." Larry Harvey and Jerry James, best friends, Larry a dreamer and Jerry a carpenter, built an 8-foot-high wooden figure resembling a man and burn it on the beach for the summer solstice. It's little more than a family picnic. Larry and Jerry each brought their young boys, their ex-wives, and their roommates. The boys fashioned a wooden dog to accompany the man. Not sure how to make a fire, they doused the figure with gasoline and light it, which goes up like a second sun. Strangers come running from everywhere on the beach, which creates a party around it. Larry, excited by that response, decides to do it again the next year, but bigger, of course. Jerry James, the carpenter, helped Larry build a man that was a little taller, about 15 feet, and a little more elaborate that second time. But it was still a small affair, maybe 20, 30 people, but they had a tradition on their hands already. Then in 1988, I heard about some people who were planning to burn a wooden man on Baker Beach on the solstice. This is when Larry started referring to the figure as Burning Man in order to keep people from calling it the Wicker Man, which was not its inspiration. Even I assumed they were pagans or something, but it sounded fun, so a friend and I went down to the beach. But there were no pagans. It was Larry Harvey and Jerry James collaborating on this very Dada anti-art project of creation and destruction. At 30 feet, their third man was twice as tall and more complex. Their arms were made to pivot by pulling on a rope after he stood erect. This time, the man was stuffed with kerosene paper and burlap. I found it all really interesting. After that, I kept in touch with him. Since I was the principal editor of the Cacophony Society newsletter, I decided I'd list the next year's event in a future issue of our monthly newsletter. When the Cacophony Society saw the event listed in our June 1989 newsletter, which was perpetually titled Rough Draft, the number of attendees quadrupled. Cacophony came out in force and pitched in to help with logistics, communication, and construction. By now, the man had become 40 feet tall, the height that would remain for the next 2 decades. It took several pickup trucks to haul the parts down to the beach. Participation is high in these first years, with lots of hands to sneak the parts down to the beach for assembly, before the authorities could notice. Then in 1990, we showed up on the beach with 400 people and a 4-story wooden man. And we hit a limit imposed by a regulatory environment. As darkness approached, we prepared to erect the man. But this time, the authorities arrived before we could strike a match and said, "You can't do this here. Where's your permit?" We were outlaws. We had no permit. Here, Jerry James and Larry Harvey discussed the matter as an apprehensive crew member looks on. After much negotiation, we convinced the authorities that we would erect the man but not burn it. The crowd, many of whom were drunk and had simply come for the spectacle, were not happy. Amid cries of "burn it anyway," Larry realized the event was not the same anymore. It was too easy to show up and have an opinion. It was now attracting the wrong people. But even with an angry crowd, we kept our word. We had a party around the man, but we did not burn it on the beach that night. And it turned out okay because we'd heard about a place far out in Nevada where you could burn a giant wooden man. 2 months after the solstice event on the beach was shut down by the police, a new event was listed in rough draft. It was called Zone Trip Number 4, Bad Day at Black Rock. Cacophonous John Law and Kevin Evans had been planning an event in the Black Rock Desert, a place outside the reach of urban rules and regulations. And now we decided to bring Larry's homeless sculpture with us. The Black Rock Desert is a 400 square mile dry lake bed, the remains of a vast lake that once covered most of northern Nevada 10,000 years ago. The Playa is a barren flat plain devoid of plants and animals. There are no rocks there. This is liminal space, a true Surrealist tabula rasa, or blank slate upon which you can make a mark. We had heard about marvelous things happening on that tabula rasa, like the Black Rock Invitational golf tournament, where the greens were beautifully painted with food coloring, and games of giant croquet using pickup trucks for mallets. The Black Rock Desert has a reputation as a place to make bold statements. And so we arrived Labor Day weekend in 1990. The distance from San Francisco and the difficulty of surviving in a harsh independence down off the pavement at the edge of the Black Rock Desert. And I took a stick, I drew a line on the ground and said, "On the other side of this line, everything will be different." Then we all stepped across that line together. We brought with us Larry's Burning Man and the cacophony principles of participation, costuming, absurdity, cleaning up after ourselves, and the rest. We've come a long way since we pulled on a rope together to raise that first man in the Black Rock Desert. Burning Man is now 70,000 people, 600 mutant vehicles, over 1,000 theme camps, and 400 plus art projects. And Burning Man goes beyond the Black Rock Desert. There are now more than 80 Burning Man regional organizations in 34 countries. And we've become a testing ground for new ideas and new technologies. I was working at Jasmine Technologies on peripheral hardware for the Macintosh when I and a coworker first ventured out to that 1988 burn on the beach. I brought my technology experience to Burning Man. I kept in touch with friends and associates in Silicon Valley, and I invited them to come to the event in the desert. Word of mouth got out quickly. Brewster Kahle, founder of the Internet Archive, was the first person to get married at Burning Man in 1993. In 1995, before cell phones and broadband, we assembled our first direct communication to the outside world. This pixelated photo was uploaded to the internet using a Yagi antenna, a microlink, and a 56 kbaud modem over a phone line. In 1996, Burning Man's following in the tech industry was firmly established after we appeared on the cover of Wired magazine. Here, the first ever Google Doodle in 1998 was noticed to the world that the kids were out playing. Please leave a voicemail. Remember voicemail? In 2001, Eric Schmidt was chosen as Google CEO in part because he had been to Burning Man. The lobby of the Google campus is full of Burning Man photographs. Philip Rosedale, founder of the virtual world called Second Life, first came to Burning Man in 1999. He had already had his hardware and software designed. Then he realized that the participant-created content of Burning Man would be an excellent social model for his virtual world. Here he is logging onto the virtual Playa from the real-life Playa. By now, our population was growing exponentially. In 2000, we got control of our perimeter when I set up a marine radar system to monitor our fence line, and night vision for our perimeter patrols. Perimeter remains my favorite volunteer job on the Playa. There's something about being out there on the cool, dark edge of all that creativity that makes you realize how fragile it is. The ideas born here were not always high-tech. The first hexayurt prototype was tested at Burning Man in 2003 by its inventor, Vinay Gupta. Made of insulation board and bidirectional filament tape, it's a very effective disaster relief shelter, as well as a low-cost insulated shelter option at Burning Man. In 2018, there were more than 3,500 hexayurts at Burning Man. Many ideas which were first tested at Burning Man have become major businesses. Green Man was the theme for 2007. A tent-like pavilion underneath the man demonstrated many sustainability projects, and the pavilion was powered by a large solar array. The solar panels left over from the man-based pavilion were used to launch BlackRock Solar, the first 501c3 nonprofit solar company in the United States. And quietly parked underneath the pavilion was the first Tesla prototype. Many of the biggest thinkers in Silicon Valley have been inspired by their Burning Man experience. The principles of Burning Man, play, collaborative creativity, communal effort, radical inclusion, civic responsibility, participation, have been baked into the collaborative work culture of Silicon Valley. Art and technology have merged at Burning Man. In 2017, the tree of Ténéré was 4 stories tall and engineered to support 60 climbers at a time. It's the largest interactive canvas ever created. More than 170,000 LEDs are hidden inside 25,000 leaves. Not content just to make it beautiful, they made it interactive with its own open source software that responds to voices, heartbeats, and brainwaves of people nearby. This year on the Playa, the artists and engineers of Studio Drift performed a murmuration of 600 drones in tribute to Larry Harvey's ideas and vision. After burning the first man on a beach 32 years ago, our founder passed away. I leave you with this thought. Murmuration is one of nature's simplest algorithms with only 3 rules: separation, alignment, and cohesion. It's a strong metaphor for Burning Man. 70,000 individuals voluntarily aligned and headed for the same future.